Okay, I'll give it a go. I think before answering that question, there's a general framework that we have to get in mind, and that is the crisis of the left. 2008 and the recession, the credit crunch, and everything that followed from that has not just been a crisis of capitalism, as we're used to hearing, but most importantly, for our purposes, it's also a crisis of the left. And if you're a materialist, if you're a Marxist in any way, I don't know if everyone here is, but if you are, then I think that logically follows. I think you would expect that the institutions of the left, being embedded in the social formations that are affected by crisis, would themselves be thrown into crisis. So there's three ways in which this manifests itself, which partly answers your question just by talking about it. First, it sharpens and throws into relief the dimension of crisis which already befell the left. So it's not just a conjunctural crisis, it's a structural crisis. Three ways. First of all, the traditional social democratic left has been losing its base. Across the board, it's been losing its connection with its voting base, which has been fragmenting off in various different directions for about 30 years now. It has been losing its ideological distinctiveness as it has been colonized by neoliberal ideology and practices. It has been losing its historic sort of repertoire of tactics and strategies. In other words, the social democracy has been the major form in which leftist politics has been expressed in the continent, and it currently has no ability to answer, to analyse or explain the current crisis of capitalism, or to propose any solutions other than milder versions of the austerity remedies that the parties of the right have been pushing. So that's social democracy. Then there's the old communist parties, aging, very subcultural. You know, they're not the kinds of routines and rituals that they're interested in are the kinds of things that don't interest particularly newer generations of leftists. They're very conservative tactically, generally speaking politically far more moderate than their rhetoric and their formal ideological commitments would allow. Two examples where communists actually got into government in Cyprus and Moldova. I mean, did you see any serious challenge to market-based politics, to neoliberalism? I don't think so. So you see these parties also experiencing a secular long-term decline, not just a decline in their formal substantive politics, but a decline in their ability to relate to a wider audience in most cases. And the various remedies adopted to fix that, Eurocommunism being one of them, did nothing really except accelerate and accentuate the crisis. Okay, then there's the far left, the various parties of the revolutionary left, which more or less, most of them thrived since the 1960s, at least I think in Western Europe, and in the context of the revolutions in Southern Europe, but also just general tumult in Northwestern Europe too. And these organizations have singularly failed to respond effectively to the crisis of capitalism. They failed, I think, largely because they did not, I mean, I'm speaking in a very general way here, so I don't know if one can speak about every Trotskyist or Maoist or revolutionary left formation in this way, but in general, I think they failed because their analysis of capitalism and neoliberalism was not up to date, it was not up to speed. That in order to preserve their ideological purity and rectitude, all too often they refused to face up to certain changes that were taking place in the composition of the working class, in the way in which capitalism was organized. And so you had a sort of defense of treasured orthodoxies rather than an attempt to face up to realities. They started with the good old things rather than the bad new things, the opposite of Brexit vice. So there's three sort of sectors of the left, all of them in crisis. I mentioned the crisis of the far left. I just want to specify something. The crisis of the far left is very particular to the Anglophone far left. I mean, I don't know much beyond that, but there's a very particular element of it in the Anglophone. Some of you will already know, with failure on other forms of politics, such as gender politics. Again, the refusal to incorporate and understand the contribution of feminist movements was a largely defensive and reactive posture, an attempt to sort of conserve the purity of a Marxist commitment. And that has come back in a seriously destructive way now. And they are historically at a loss as a result. And this fragmentation, by the way, is happening in several organisations, not just the Socialist Works Party from Typo.
It seems like with the crisis, I think it's fine. With the crisis of the left, during the times of crisis of the left, which corresponds to the economic crisis throughout Europe, there has been a kind of movement which has come out of this crisis, which is not in crisis, and which is spreading as a strategy, as a tactic, as an occurrence throughout Europe, and these are the social movements. I mean, Indignados, taking the model of Occupy, and in your articles you have said that you have written that this social movements have not succeeded to win even to inflict a single damage on austerity. And you've kind of pointed out the limitations of these social movements, which only focus on kicking off and resisting and advocating for broader alliances. Could you at least describe the context in which these social movements appear, and in particular their kind of allergy or being alienated from political parties and having kind of very bad attitudes towards aligning with certain structures from left or the far left?
Yeah, well, this is why I get called pessimistic. Look, the thing about historic social movements that have been successful, I don't know if you want to think about the anti-Vietnam War movement, the civil rights movement. I'm sorry, my examples are going to be largely American-based because that's where my area of study is. But if you look at them, what you find is that there is something that present-day social movements actually lack, and that is an infrastructure. They don't have any infrastructure. I mean, that's an overstatement, obviously. There are forms of organisation. There are ways in which people stay in touch and pull together large numbers of people and raise money and produce publicity and so on. But there's a real etiolation, sorry, that's an obscure word, there's a real breakdown of the institutions that have traditionally been able to sustain social movements. A breakdown of political parties, a breakdown of in the wake of neoliberalism, and even of things like churches. I mean, the traditional role of churches. I know it's different in Macedonia, but certainly the traditional role of churches in the United States and being able to mobilize people is even that is run down to some extent. So there's, I mean, and it doesn't apply in the United Kingdom really to any significant extent. So what you get is pathological symptoms. There's two ways in which this comes out. One is the NGOization of left-wing politics. That is, you get small groups of people who are very media savvy and who are sort of tightly knit and reasonably well organised, or the big if, I don't know if you've heard about this. And they're a social movement, but they simulate the appearance of one. They have celebrity sort of telebroadcasts and advertisements, and they create a big kerfuffle. And then there's a big glorious day of reckoning in which everybody meets in a big park, and there's a rock concert, and they have a big orgasmic explosion of you know, everything's, it's happening, and then they go home apparently satisfied with this, and nothing has changed, you know. This is, you know, this is one of the pathological symptoms, but you get this with certain kinds of left-wing group as well. The other is this sort of anti-political sort of tendencies. Yeah. I mean, I don't think that one should be sectarian about this. On the other hand, I'm going to be. On the other hand, I think that there is an element of it being a pathology of defeat and fragmentation. That is to say, given the historic collapse of any attempt to form a kind of genuinely democratic form of organisation which can fuse significant sections of the population, concentrate their interest in a political form, help lead a struggle, and so on. You know, given that every single attempt has either failed in ignominy or has resulted in some sort of bizarre bureaucratic distortion, then, you know, logically, there's an element of giving up. There's an element of people saying, "Well, the hell with that," you know. We don't need that level of organisation. We can rely on people's individual initiative, and somehow, out of interaction, our collective interaction, hopefully through the internet, you know, this is another fetish that's coming about now, mediated by the internet, we will spontaneously generate the types of organisation that we need. And I feel I should have just finished that observation. I feel that one should foreground the way in which this overlaps with a kind of neoliberal ideology. And the central claim that neoliberalism makes is that we do not need, in fact the last thing we need, is any kind of planned social organisation. That this necessarily leads to tyranny, it leads to inefficiency and distortion. Therefore, what we need is to allow the spontaneous order of the market to do its job. And if you can create market-like structures in every area of life, from the government to the internet to wherever, if people interact on that basis and somehow information is spontaneously accumulated and sent out again in signals a bit like price signals. You know, so on Twitter you have your trending topics, your hashtags and what have you. These are almost like price signals. They tell you what's hot and what's not. Well, this is kind of, there's a certain overlap there, and there's a way in which people can end up rationalising the very irrelevance, the very powerlessness that has been inflicted on them. They can end up treating it as if it's a virtue, as if something to be embraced, rather than a problem.
Well, basically, you consider that in some sort of sense, the left was retreated from the public space, from the terrain, during these social movements across Europe. As I think in others, you had the students' movement in the UK, and also in Italy and Greece. Let's not forget that Greece is a particular case, and there are some different conditions apply there. But I think there was a genuine withdrawal of the left from the space in order not to be conceived as sectarian or as hawks who come in and try to kidnap movements. How do you think, or how do you evaluate the fact that this kind of springs of movements across Europe, I mean, had their points of increased resistance and disobedience, and then they kind of slowly retrieved or ended up without a significant effect, or as you say, without inflicting even a single damage to austerity. And then now, can we expect that after this kind of easing or kind of retrieving of social movements and social protests across Europe, can we expect that there is kind of a space for the left, for different structures on the left to take on, and in this middle time to build alliances with whatever structures have been left still alive of these social movements, to kind of either incorporate them or build large-based social alliances in order to try at least to provide for a leftist bloc in different, I'm aware that there are different contexts throughout Europe, but might this be a moment which the left might attempt to use in order to build such coalitions and such blocks?
Yeah, I should correct myself. There is one instance where austerity has been defeated, an austerity government implementing a savage austerity measure, and that's in Quebec, the province of Quebec in Canada. Now, you could argue that that belongs to a different cycle. It belongs to the cycle of student protests from the 2000s, possibly. However, it was an explicitly austerity-led measure. So the question is, to answer your question, how did they win? Because they did win. I mean, it was a provisional success. You know, it's susceptible to being rolled back, and there's all sorts of problems. But in the immediate term, well, you can look at what they did. I mean, the student movement there did have an infrastructure. They had a long tradition of building up direct democracy. They had real organisation on campuses. So it wasn't like in the United Kingdom. I don't know what your experience is in Macedonia, but in the United Kingdom, the National Union of Students is effectively turning itself into a lobby. You know, it does precious little for students. It's not really a democratic institution. It's very difficult to be involved, and its most directly political role is to catapult certain ambitious and attractive young students, well, not always attractive, into the role of a Labour Party candidate for the election. And this is, you know, maybe you have the same sort of experience, but in Quebec it was different.
In the Conservative Party, for the moment, in the Left Party.
Oh my God, that's cool. Okay. See, I never thought that we in the UK could actually pity the left somewhere else. All right, so they had forms of direct democracy. Not only that, but they set out to build social alliances. They went out looking for alliances with organised workers. Now, they could not get the trade union bureaucracy to actually call strikes and stuff like that. But they could mount solidarity actions with workers who were on strike. They did get some dough out of the trade union bureaucracy, which is not nothing. You know, and they won over working class people in their communities. You know, you had the famous pots and pans protests of working class people coming out in the streets at night and bashing their pots and pans. I don't know what. You know, but the point is that it basically signalled that people were powerfully opposed to it. So the government upped the stakes consistently, and they sent the police after them. Now, here's the question: at that point, do you try to appease the forces of law and order? Do you try and appease the media? Because just as in the UK, you know, we had this problem. When the government says your protests are illegal, it's not just a threat of violence. There's a strong normative and ideological pressure not to protest, you know. So the student movement in Quebec said, no, fuck off. They organised, not only did they refuse to tell the police where they were going to be marching, they sent the police an image of their route which was shaped roughly like that. And yeah, and essentially they, I mean, I'm not suggesting that people should, I'm encouraging this but I am saying that their disregard for how they would be received by the media, how they would be received within the consensus of law and order, meant that they were able to go on and continue to wage a militant struggle, which in the end, you know, the government bet everything on the election results, and in the end, actually, the government lost in quite a serious way. It's not just, it didn't just lose because of the organisation, the Parti Québécois, you know, the left nationalist grouping, whatever. I mean, they were pretty pathetic. It was actually the government's base split because it was totally incapacitated by the student movement. So its base split between two different parties, one ultra neoliberal and so on. So what I would say is, for us, we didn't have anything. I mean, you know, I don't overstate it, and I know not everywhere is like England, but generally speaking, the infrastructure of social movements is much more depleted. So that when social movements come up, you know, they're always going to dissipate. That's going to happen. This question is, what residue do they leave behind? What traces do they leave? Do they leave any forms of institution that can be capable of sustaining ideas and strategies and certain discussions through difficult times, and that can help propel new movements towards success? And generally speaking, they don't, and this is a problem. So therefore, I propose 3 strategic orientations. Okay? One, and these are all a process of reconstruction, and therefore they take time. They take maybe a generation or so. One is the rebuilding of the sort of basic grassroots from below infrastructure that makes it possible to have a successful social movement. And by that I don't mean, you know, having a think tank or something like that. I mean building in communities on issues that come to ordinary people. In the United Kingdom, in working class areas, you can build up campaigns against the so-called bedroom tax. I don't know if you've heard about this.
Yeah.
Okay. You can build up campaigns of tenants who want to oppose rent increases. You know, these are local, very issue-specific, but they bring people together in a way that neoliberalism prefers to keep them apart. Okay, so you can, if you can find spaces like that where you can actually get people together a much larger and wider layer of people than those who are explicitly politicized and who know that they're politicized. Second, I think is you need a reconstruction of that symbolic space within which a left alternative is feasible and means something, because of the, you know, I mean, it's not just 1989 and all that. I really think the classical model of socialism has utterly collapsed. And I don't mean to say that we can just therefore forget about it. We cannot. It's, you know, it's our legacy. I think we're on the left, and we'll have to assimilate it and figure out what went wrong. But there's a traditional three-legged vision. There is the ideological sort of normative goal of socialism. There's a general view about what socialism is, whether it's state control or workers' control or something else. There's a long-term strategy, whether it's reform through the state or sort of revolutionary overthrow of capitalism. And then there's the agency that's capable of implementing it, usually the working class. I mean, all 3 of those layers, I mean, have been attacked and weakened. And I don't think it's just something that's happened since 1989 or even since the 1970s. I think it's something to do with the post-war period and the collapse of what used to be called the vanguard, you know, the self-organized layers of rank-and-file workers and so on. So, I think rebuilding that space means building in a space that is being vacated, and that is where the social democracy used to be.
Yeah, this was basically my next question. Basically, you talked about the